The morning of June 22, 1945, brought no relief to the stifling bunker beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal Koichi Kido watched as Emperor Hirohito, the man his subjects called a living deity, stared at the decoded military dispatch with an expression that resembled something dangerously close to despair. The message was brief, clinical in its bureaucratic precision: organized resistance on Okinawa had ceased. 82 days. That was all it had taken for the largest amphibious armada in human history to grind through Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima's 32nd Army and claim the last significant barrier between American bombers and the sacred home islands. Kido had seen many troubling reports cross the Emperor's desk throughout this terrible war, but this one seemed to drain something fundamental from the room itself. Because everyone in that bunker understood what those 82 days truly meant, the cornerstone of Japan's final strategy, the plan that was supposed to break American will and force a negotiated peace, had not merely failed. It had revealed something far more terrifying, that perhaps no amount of Japanese sacrifice, no depth of courage or spiritual resolve, could bridge the chasm between what Japan possessed and what the United States could bring to bear. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand the psychological earthquake that shook the Imperial Japanese High Command on that sweltering June morning, one must first grasp the intricate web of beliefs, strategies, and desperate calculations that had led Japan's leadership to stake everything on Okinawa's defense. By the spring of 1945, no one in Tokyo's inner circles harbored illusions about Japan's material situation. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the pride of the nation and the instrument of stunning victories at Pearl Harbor and across the Pacific, existed now only as scattered remnants cowering in ports with insufficient fuel to sortie. The merchant marine that had connected Japan's far-flung empire lay at the bottom of the Pacific, victim to American submarines that had turned Japan's sea lanes into graveyards. American B-29 superfortresses had transformed Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and dozens of other cities into smoking wastelands, their firebombing campaigns killing hundreds of thousands of civilians and obliterating the industrial capacity Japan needed to continue the war. Yet the Japanese High Command had not been planning for victory in any conventional sense since at least the previous autumn. They had been planning for survival, or more precisely, for a kind of national resurrection through the ancient samurai principle of fighting so ferociously, inflicting such terrible costs on the enemy, that even in defeat they might win something approximating honor and, critically, better terms than unconditional surrender. This strategy had a name, Ketsugo, meaning decisive operation. It envisioned turning the entire Japanese homeland into a fortress, mobilizing every man, woman, and child for a final apocalyptic battle that would make the Americans pay such an unbearable price in blood that they would accept a negotiated settlement preserving the imperial system and avoiding occupation of Japanese soil. But Ketsugo required something essential: time. Time to train the millions of civilian volunteers with bamboo spears and agricultural implements. Time to stockpile what remained of Japan's ammunition and fuel for the climactic battle. Time to fortify the beaches of Kyushu where American intelligence suggested the invasion would come. And most critically, time to demonstrate to the Americans through one more savage island battle that the cost of conquering Japan would be so catastrophic that even their vast industrial might and democratic willpower would falter. Okinawa was to provide that time and that demonstration. The island, 60 miles long and ranging from 2 to 18 miles wide, was officially part of Okinawa Prefecture, sovereign Japanese territory, not a conquered colony like the Philippines or a mandated island like Saipan. Its population of roughly 490,000 Japanese citizens meant that for the first time, American forces would be fighting on ground that Japan considered absolutely integral to the homeland itself. Lieutenant General Ushijima had been given approximately 100,000 troops drawn from the 32nd Army, along with thousands of Okinawan conscripts and auxiliary forces. But more importantly, he had been given a mission that Imperial General Headquarters believed could alter the war's trajectory. The strategy was elegantly simple in concept but brutally demanding in execution. Unlike previous island battles where Japanese forces had met American landings at the water's edge with suicidal banzai charges, Ushijima and his chief of operations, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, designed a defense in depth that would bleed the Americans through a grinding war of attrition. The island's southern region, with its complex terrain of ridges, ravines, and the ancient fortress of Shuri Castle, had been transformed into an underground fortress over months of preparation. Thousands of caves, interconnected tunnels, bunkers, and fortified positions turned every hill and ridge into a death trap. Artillery pieces were carefully registered to deliver devastating fire on predetermined killing zones. Machine gun nests covered every avenue of approach with interlocking fields of fire. The plan was predicated on making the Americans pay for every yard with blood, not just to delay them, but to shock American public opinion and political leadership with casualty lists that would recall the nightmare of the Western Front in the First World War. Japanese intelligence had noted carefully the growing war weariness in America as the conflict stretched into its fourth year. Reports filtered back about labor unrest, about the difficulties of demobilization and redeployment, about newspaper editorials questioning how much more American blood should be spilled. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, the Big Six who effectively ran Japan's war effort, believed that if one more island could replicate the horror of Iwo Jima, where American forces had suffered 26,000 casualties taking an 8-square-mile volcanic rock, but on a far larger and more strategically vital scale, then perhaps, just perhaps, President Harry Truman might accept something less than unconditional surrender. This was not mere fantasy. Japan's entire strategic culture was shaped by the memory of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904–1905, when a series of costly but indecisive battles had culminated in the dramatic naval victory at Tsushima. Despite Japan's material exhaustion and inability to continue the war, the psychological impact of Tsushima and the mounting Russian casualties had led to a negotiated peace mediated by American President Theodore Roosevelt, a settlement that allowed Japan to emerge as a recognized great power. The military leadership in 1945, many of whom had been junior officers during that earlier conflict or had been raised on its legends, believed history could repeat itself. One more Tsushima, one more demonstration of Japanese martial spirit so terrible that it would shatter enemy resolve, and negotiations might become possible. Okinawa was also to be supported by a massive aerial assault unlike anything the Americans had yet experienced. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy Air Forces, though severely depleted, had been husbanding their remaining aircraft and training pilots for the Kyushu, floating chrysanthemum, operations that would unleash thousands of kamikaze suicide attacks on the American fleet. If Japanese pilots could sink or damage enough transports, supply ships, and warships, they might isolate the American ground forces and make their position untenable. The kamikaze was not merely a weapon, it was a statement, a demonstration that Japanese fighting spirit transcended material calculations and rational cost-benefit analysis. How, the reasoning went, could a democratic nation that valued individual life above all continue a war against an enemy willing to weaponize death itself? To further support this strategy, the Imperial Japanese Navy made one last, desperate gesture. On April 7, the super battleship Yamato, the largest and most powerful warship ever built, was dispatched on a one-way mission to Okinawa. With only enough fuel for a single voyage and no air cover, Yamato was to fight through the American fleet, beach herself on Okinawa's shores, and use her massive 18-inch guns as coastal artillery while her crew of 2,700 sailors fought as naval infantry. It was a suicide mission elevated to the level of national myth, the mightiest symbol of Japanese naval power sacrificing itself in a final blaze of glory that would inspire the nation and demonstrate that Japan would never surrender. This, then, was the edifice of hope and desperate calculation upon which Japan's leaders pinned their survival strategy in the spring of 1945. Okinawa would be the anvil upon which American resolve would be tested and found wanting. The battle would last months, would cost tens of thousands of American casualties, would demonstrate that the price of conquering the home islands would be measured in hundreds of thousands or millions of American dead. Faced with such apocalyptic projections, surely even the most hardened American warmongers would accept a compromise that preserved the emperor and spared Japan the shame of occupation. But in their calculations, the Japanese High Command had made one fundamental miscalculation. They had assumed that the Battle of Okinawa would unfold according to a certain timetable and logic, that sheer determination and willingness to die could offset material superiority, that geography and tactics could multiply the effectiveness of their limited forces, that the Americans had some breaking point beyond which their will to fight would crack. They were about to discover that will alone, no matter how fierce, could not withstand the full weight of American industrial might and military competence when applied with systematic ruthlessness. The American invasion force that appeared off Okinawa's shores on April 1 was not merely large, it was incomprehensibly vast by any standard of warfare known to history. More than 1,500 ships carrying more than 180,000 soldiers and Marines of the 10th Army under Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner represented the largest amphibious operation mounted in the Pacific War, surpassing even the Normandy landings in Europe. The Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance, supported by the British Pacific Fleet operating as Task Force 57, brought together such overwhelming naval power that it represented more tonnage than the entire Imperial Japanese Navy had possessed at its height. But it was not merely the quantity that should have terrified Japanese planners, it was the quality of coordination and the efficiency of American logistics. Every division landing at Okinawa arrived with full equipment, abundant ammunition, complete medical support, and supply lines stretching back across 8,000 miles of ocean that functioned with industrial precision. American ships unloaded tanks, artillery pieces, ammunition, medical supplies, food, and fuel in quantities that would have seemed like fever dreams to Ushijima's logistics officers, who struggled to provision their troops with basic necessities through submarine-infested waters. The air campaigns supporting the invasion demonstrated American mastery in 3 dimensions. Carrier-based aircraft swept Japanese airfields, while superfortresses from the Marianas pounded Japanese staging areas and supply lines. When the kamikazes did come, and they came in terrifying numbers, nearly 2,000 suicide sorties over the course of the battle, American radar picket ships detected them far from the invasion fleet, and combat air patrols vectored by skilled fighter directors intercepted them before they could reach the vital transport ships. The kamikazes sank 26 ships and damaged 164 others, killing nearly 5,000 American sailors and traumatizing countless more. But they failed in their essential mission. They did not isolate the ground forces or force the Americans to withdraw. In Yamato, that magnificent symbol of Japanese naval might and samurai resolve, American submarines spotted her sortie from the inland sea before she cleared Japanese home waters. On April 7, barely 200 miles from Okinawa, carrier aircraft from Task Force 58, more than 300 planes, descended on the Yamato force in waves. The Americans had been instructed to concentrate their torpedo attacks on one side of the ship to prevent effective counterflooding, and to aim for the bow and stern where armor was thinnest. After 2 hours of systematic attack, Yamato rolled over and exploded, taking over 2,400 of her crew to the bottom. The supposed death ride that would inspire the nation instead demonstrated that even Japan's mightiest symbols were helpless against American material superiority and tactical competence. On Okinawa itself, the initial American landing had been eerily unopposed. Admiral Spruance had famously messaged Admiral Chester Nimitz that he might be crazy, but it looked like the Japanese had quit the war, to which Nimitz drily replied, "Delete all after crazy." But Ushijima had simply chosen not to waste his men in futile beach defenses. He waited in his prepared positions in the south, and when the Americans reached them, the real battle began. What followed was exactly what Japanese planners had envisioned, and simultaneously a revelation of why their strategy was doomed. The fighting in southern Okinawa through May and June became a nightmarish meat grinder. Places with names like Kakaza Ridge, Hacksaw Ridge, Sugarloaf Hill, and Shuri Castle became synonymous with sustained horror. American infantry advanced behind massive artillery barrages only to find Japanese defenders emerging from caves and tunnels to contest every position. Flamethrowers, satchel charges, grenades, and hand-to-hand combat decided the fate of individual holes in the ground. The rain turned the battlefield into a muddy hell where the living stumbled over the unburied dead. Psychological casualties, combat fatigue, reached unprecedented levels as men broke under the sustained strain. American casualties climbed exactly as the Japanese had hoped. By battle's end, American forces would suffer approximately 49,000 casualties, including over 12,000 killed, numbers that did exceed the ratio of previous island battles and did send shockwaves through American military planning. Lieutenant General Buckner himself was killed by Japanese artillery fire on June 18, making him the highest-ranking American officer killed in action during the entire war. The beloved war correspondent Ernie Pyle, whose dispatches had humanized the American fighting man for millions back home, died from a Japanese machine gun burst. But here was where Japanese calculations collided brutally with reality. The Americans did not break. They did not falter. They did not consider withdrawal or negotiate. Instead, they simply brought more artillery shells to pulverize every suspected position, more tanks and flamethrowers to reduce every strongpoint, more naval gunfire to obliterate every ridge and reverse slope, more supply ships to sustain the offensive, more replacement troops to feed into the assault. The United States possessed such vast reserves of men and material that even catastrophic casualties by previous standards represented a sustainable cost. America was simultaneously fighting Germany in Europe, projecting power across two oceans, sustaining allies around the globe, and still had ample capacity to methodically grind down Japanese resistance with systematic, industrial-scale violence. For the Japanese defenders, the reality became inescapable as May turned to June. No reinforcements were coming. No supplies were breaking through the American blockade. No miraculous intervention would alter the mathematics of the situation. Colonel Yahara, watching his carefully designed defensive system being systematically dismantled by overwhelming firepower, understood what it meant. On June 22, after his two superiors, General Ushijima and Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, committed ritual suicide in their command cave to avoid capture, Yahara attempted to ask permission to join them. Ushijima refused him with words that proved prophetic: "If you die, there will be no one left who knows the truth about the Battle of Okinawa. Bear the temporary shame but endure it. This is an order from your army commander." The truth Ushijima wanted preserved was this: Japan's finest defensive strategy, implemented by competent commanders with highly motivated troops on favorable terrain supported by thousands of suicide aircraft, had delayed the Americans for 82 days at enormous cost. But it had not stopped them. It had not broken their will. It had not forced negotiations. It had simply demonstrated with mathematical precision exactly what an invasion of the home islands would entail: a systematic, mechanized annihilation of Japanese resistance regardless of how fiercely Japanese forces fought or how willingly they died. When news of Okinawa's fall reached Tokyo on June 22, it arrived in a city that had been systematically destroyed by incendiary raids, to a government operating from underground bunkers, to military leaders who had been receiving increasingly desperate reports for months about the inability of Japanese forces in China and Manchuria to mount effective operations, about the complete collapse of Japan's defensive perimeter, about the starvation spreading through the home islands as the American submarine blockade strangled all imports of food and raw materials. The fall of Okinawa was not merely another tactical defeat, it was the empirical refutation of Japan's last hope. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War convened an emergency session on the afternoon of June 22, hours after receiving confirmation that organized resistance on Okinawa had ceased. The 6 men who gathered in the underground conference room beneath the Imperial Palace represented the absolute apex of Japanese military and political authority: Prime Minister Admiral Kentaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, Army Minister General Korechika Anami, Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yanai, Chief of the Army General Staff General Yashijiro Yumizu, and Chief of the Navy General Staff Admiral Somu Toyoda. The atmosphere in that room was suffocating, not merely from the lack of ventilation in the bunker, but from the weight of what they all knew but could not yet speak aloud: the war was lost, and every additional day of fighting was leading Japan toward complete annihilation. What these men said to each other in the weeks following Okinawa's fall, and more critically, what they refused to say in official channels, revealed the profound paralysis gripping Japan's leadership. The Supreme Council operated under a peculiar constitutional arrangement that required unanimous consent for any major decision regarding the conduct of the war. This meant that even if 5 members recognized the necessity of seeking peace, a single dissenting voice could prevent any action. It was a recipe for deadlock, and in the summer of 1945, that deadlock was pushing Japan toward national suicide. The most immediate question facing the council was stark: what did Okinawa's fall actually mean for Japan's strategic position? Admiral Toyota, the chief of the Navy General Staff, was the newest member of the council, having replaced Admiral Koshiro Ikawa on May 29 after the first serious formal discussion about potentially ending the war. Oikawa had believed the war was clearly lost and had resigned when the council refused to formally consider peace proposals. Toyota, by contrast, belonged firmly to the hardline faction alongside Army Minister Anami and Army Chief Yumizu. In the days following Okinawa's fall, these 3 men maintained publicly that the battle had actually succeeded in its essential mission. It had inflicted such severe casualties on the Americans that Operation Katsugo, the defense of the home islands, remained viable. Their argument was not entirely without merit, at least superficially. American casualties at Okinawa had indeed been catastrophic by any previous standard: 49,000 battle casualties, 12,000 dead, with another 33,000 non-battle casualties including thousands of psychiatric cases. The American casualty ratio to Japanese had shifted from the historical 5-1 in America's favor to nearly 2-1 at Okinawa. If these ratios held for an invasion of Kyushu, the southernmost home island, and then for an assault on Honshu and Tokyo itself, the Americans might suffer casualties numbering in the hundreds of thousands, possibly over 1 million. Surely, the hardliners argued, no democracy could sustain such losses without political crisis. But this argument overlooked something fundamental that the more perceptive members of the council understood with growing dread. The Americans had sustained those terrible casualties and had not hesitated, had not slowed, had not shown the slightest indication of reconsidering their approach. More tellingly, even as the Battle of Okinawa raged, American forces were simultaneously preparing for the next operation. Intelligence reports confirmed that massive troop movements were underway, that invasion planning for Operation Olympic, the assault on Kyushu scheduled for November 1945, was proceeding on schedule, and that the Americans were assembling forces of such magnitude that the Okinawa operation would seem modest by comparison. It was Prime Minister Suzuki, a retired admiral who had commanded the combined fleet in the 1920s, who best articulated the shift in perspective that Okinawa forced upon at least some members of the council. In testimony given months later, after Japan's surrender, Suzuki explained the strategic calculation with brutal clarity. Before Okinawa, the Supreme Council had proceeded with one plan: fighting a decisive battle at the landing point when the Americans invaded Kyushu. They believed they could make the cost so terrible that negotiations would become inevitable. They proceeded with that plan right up until the atomic bombs fell in August. But Okinawa had revealed something crucial about that plan's fundamental assumption. The Japanese strategy presumed that the Americans would have to invade, would have to come ashore and fight for every meter of Japanese soil in the kind of grinding infantry combat that had characterized Okinawa. In such combat, Japanese numerical superiority on home ground, combined with the willingness of the entire population to resist to the death, might indeed exact an unbearable price. But Okinawa demonstrated that the Americans possessed alternatives to direct assault. They had the naval power to maintain an indefinite blockade, the air power to reduce Japanese cities to ash from bases now within easy range, and most ominously, the patience and material reserves to simply continue the systematic destruction of Japan without risking American lives in frontal assaults if the cost became prohibitive. This realization struck at the heart of Katsugo's logic. If the Americans chose not to invade but instead to simply starve and burn Japan into submission from sea and air, then all the preparations, all the training of civilian volunteers with bamboo spears, all the carefully prepared beach defenses and hidden ammunition dumps became irrelevant. Japan would die slowly, its cities reduced to rubble, its population starving, without ever having the chance to inflict the casualties that might force negotiations. Emperor Hirohito's reaction to Okinawa's fall was perhaps the most significant, though it was characteristically oblique. On June 22, the same day organized resistance ended on Okinawa, the emperor made an extraordinary intervention in the Supreme Council's deliberations. In his typically enigmatic manner, Hirohito rarely gave direct orders, preferring to express wishes that subordinates were expected to divine and implement, he instructed the council to give immediate and detailed thought to ways of ending the war, noting that conditions both internal and external to Japan were growing increasingly tense. This was a dramatic shift from Hirohito's position just weeks earlier. Through May, the emperor had believed that a major Japanese military victory must precede any move toward peace, or Japan's hopes for anything other than unconditional surrender would be vain. He had even urged that Japan launch a new offensive in China to create a better negotiating position. But that suggestion had been politely ignored by his military leaders, who understood that Japan lacked the resources for any offensive operations anywhere. The fall of Okinawa, combined with reports reaching the emperor about the desperate weakness of Japanese forces in China and Manchuria, had finally convinced him that no miracle victory was coming. Yet even the emperor's intervention could not break the deadlock in the Supreme Council. The problem was not merely disagreement about whether to seek peace, but profound division over what terms might be acceptable and how to approach the Allies. Foreign Minister Togo favored seeking Soviet mediation to achieve a negotiated settlement. The Soviet Union remained officially neutral in the Pacific War, bound by the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact signed in 1941, though that pact was due to expire in April 1946. Togo and others hoped that the Soviets might be willing to mediate a peace that would preserve the imperial system and avoid occupation of Japanese soil in exchange for Japanese territorial concessions in Manchuria, Korea, and the Northern Territories. This approach was fraught with danger and delusion. Japanese intelligence had already detected signs that the Soviet Union was preparing for war against Japan. The Neutrality Pact's expiration notice had been given in April, and massive Soviet troop movements from Europe to the Far East were underway. But more fundamentally, the approach assumed that the Soviets had some interest in preserving Japanese power or in moderating American terms. In reality, Stalin had already promised Roosevelt and Churchill at the Yalta Conference in February that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. Germany had surrendered on May 8. The clock was ticking, though the Japanese leadership remained largely unaware of just how little time remained. The hardliners in the council, Anami, Umezu, and Toyota, maintained that even discussing peace terms was premature. On June 6, just 2 weeks before Okinawa's fall, the Supreme Council had voted on its formal position regarding the war. The hardliners had secured a majority for a fight-to-extinction stance, arguing that Japan must inflict heavy losses on the Americans in at least one more major battle before any peace feelers could be extended. The fall of Okinawa shook this position but did not break it. The three hardliners argued that Operation Katsugo remained viable, that the people's fighting spirit remained unbroken, that one more demonstration of Japanese resolve on the sacred soil of the home islands would surely force the Americans to negotiate. What none of them would publicly acknowledge was the fiction underlying these positions. By June 1945, the Japanese home islands were slowly starving. The American submarine blockade had reduced food imports to a trickle. Rice rations had been cut multiple times. Urban populations were being encouraged to evacuate to rural areas where food might be more available. Industrial production had collapsed not merely from the air raids but from the lack of raw materials that could no longer be imported. Oil reserves were measured in weeks. The aviation gasoline that the kamikaze forces required was being manufactured from pine root extraction, a desperate expedient that produced inferior fuel in quantities far below what was needed. More devastating still was the collapse of morale that senior leaders observed but could not discuss openly. Reports reached the Imperial Palace of graffiti appearing on walls expressing discontent with the war and even, most shockingly, questioning the emperor's role. The Kempeitai, Japan's military police, detected rising communist sentiment and the potential for civil unrest if the war continued. The Battle of Okinawa had introduced the world to a particularly horrific phenomenon, the mass civilian suicides and military-coerced deaths of Okinawan civilians, many of whom had been told that American soldiers would rape, torture, and murder them if captured. As many as 150,000 Okinawan civilians died during the battle, many from Japanese military pressure to commit suicide rather than surrender. When news of these events filtered back to the home islands, it created profound unease about what defending the homeland to the last would actually mean for Japan's civilian population. Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal Koichi Kido, Emperor Hirohito's closest advisor, understood these dynamics with particular clarity. In June, even before Okinawa's fall, Kido had presented to the emperor a memorandum proposing a path to peace through Soviet mediation. The terms Kido envisioned were extraordinarily optimistic. Japan might surrender its overseas conquests and endure a period of disarmament, but there would be no occupation of Japanese soil, thus ensuring the continuance of the imperial system and Hirohito's throne. It was essentially a vision of peace modeled on the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, painful but preserving Japan's fundamental sovereignty and political structure. This vision was, of course, completely disconnected from reality. The Allies had already declared at multiple conferences that they would accept nothing less than Japan's unconditional surrender. The Potsdam Declaration, issued on July 26 by Truman, Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek, would make this explicit: Japan must surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. The declaration made no explicit guarantee about preserving the imperial system, though it did not explicitly demand the emperor's removal either, a calculated ambiguity designed to leave Japan guessing about Hirohito's fate. But the idea that Japan could negotiate terms that avoided occupation or preserved any meaningful autonomy was pure fantasy. Yet this fantasy consumed the Supreme Council's energies through July and into August. Official Japanese diplomatic communications to the Soviet Union, intercepted and decoded by American intelligence, revealed the extent of Japanese delusion. Japanese diplomats in Moscow were instructed to approach the Soviets about mediating peace, to hint at territorial concessions, to probe for any willingness to help Japan achieve a settlement short of the unconditional surrender demanded by the Allies. The Soviet response was to string the Japanese along with vague promises of considering their proposals while making no concrete commitments, all while accelerating preparations to invade Japanese-held Manchuria. The words spoken in the Supreme Council's deliberations during this period, as recorded in post-war testimony and documents, revealed men trapped between irreconcilable realities. They could not win the war. This was understood by all of them, even the hardliners, though some refused to admit it publicly. They could not accept unconditional surrender. This violated everything they had been taught about honor, duty, and service to the emperor. They could not find a third path. No neutral mediator existed who could or would help them, and the Allies showed no inclination to modify their demands. Army Minister Anami perhaps best embodied this impossible position. In private conversations, Anami acknowledged that continuing the war would lead to national destruction. But he insisted that Japan must fight at least one more decisive battle on the home islands before opening peace negotiations, arguing that without inflicting heavy losses on an American invasion force, Japan would have no leverage to negotiate terms that preserved the emperor and avoided the shame of occupation. When pressed on what would happen if the Americans chose not to invade but simply continued bombing and blockading Japan into starvation and submission, Anami had no answer beyond appeals to fighting spirit and divine intervention. The deadlock was complete. The Supreme Council could not agree unanimously on seeking peace, so they continued preparing for Ketsugo. But these preparations were increasingly revealed as hollow. Intelligence reports confirmed that the Americans were assembling over 3 million troops for Operation Olympic and the subsequent Operation Coronet, which would assault Honshu itself. These forces would be supported by naval and air power so overwhelming that Japanese defenders would be fighting from beneath a constant rain of shells and bombs. The American military was manufacturing weapons, ammunition, and supplies at such rates that they could sustain casualties far beyond what Japan had inflicted at Okinawa and still maintain offensive momentum. What the Supreme Council could not bring itself to acknowledge, but what the fall of Okinawa had made undeniable, was that Japan's strategy had always been based on a fatal misunderstanding of American political culture and strategic calculations. The Japanese leadership had assumed that American democracy's respect for individual life would create a political breaking point, that casualties beyond a certain threshold would trigger public demands to end the war on negotiated terms rather than continue the slaughter. This calculation was not entirely irrational. it was based on Japan's own experience in the Russo-Japanese War and on observed patterns in American history where public sentiment had turned against wars that dragged on inconclusively. But what the Japanese failed to comprehend was that the American public and political leadership had defined World War II not as a war of conquest or imperial expansion, but as a war of survival against totalitarian aggression. The attack on Pearl Harbor had crystallized American resolve in ways that made the war fundamentally different from previous American conflicts. Moreover, the racist dimensions of the Pacific War, the mutual dehumanization that characterized the conflict between Japan and the Western Allies, meant that casualties that might have seemed unbearable in a European context were deemed acceptable when fighting an enemy portrayed as fanatical and subhuman. The American leadership had already concluded that Japan would only surrender when faced with complete annihilation or the certain prospect of it. Okinawa proved this conclusion correct. The United States had sustained 49,000 casualties taking the island, had seen 26 ships sunk and 164 damaged by kamikaze attacks, had lost its field army commander and its most beloved war correspondent, and had experienced combat so vicious that psychiatric casualties reached unprecedented levels. And the American response was not to negotiate or reconsider their strategy, but to immediately begin planning for an invasion projected to cost far more, and to begin examining alternatives like the atomic bomb that might force surrender without invasion. In the secret deliberations of the Supreme Council during July, one can detect in the historical record the gradual, agonizing acceptance of this reality by at least some members. Suzuki, Togo, and Navy Minister Yanai increasingly recognized that Japan was trapped in a war it could not win, could not continue indefinitely, and could not escape through negotiation on acceptable terms. But they also recognized that moving toward surrender required unanimous consent of the Council, and that consent was impossible to achieve without some external catalyst so dramatic that it would shatter the hardliners' position. The words that passed between these men were often coded, oblique, wrapped in the elaborate euphemisms of Japanese political discourse. Direct confrontation was avoided. Saving face for all parties was paramount. But underneath the polite language was a growing recognition that Japan faced a choice between two forms of national suicide: continuing the war until American forces physically occupied and destroyed Japan, or accepting surrender terms that might spell the end of the imperial system and everything the military elite had devoted their lives to defending. What made this choice particularly agonizing was that it was not merely a strategic or political calculation, but a profoundly personal and cultural crisis for every member of the Council. These men had spent decades of their lives in service to the emperor, had sent hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers and sailors to their deaths in that service, had presided over a war that had killed millions of Asian civilians under Japanese occupation. To surrender now, to accept terms dictated by the enemy, to potentially see the emperor deposed or tried as a war criminal, this was not merely defeat, but a negation of everything they had believed and fought for. Army Chief Umezu exemplified this mindset. He would later be one of the signatories to Japan's surrender document on September 2 aboard the USS Missouri, but only after a personal intervention by Emperor Hirohito prevented him from committing suicide when informed it would be his duty to sign. For Umezu and many like him, surrender was not a rational policy choice to be evaluated based on strategic circumstances. It was an unthinkable act of dishonor that violated the fundamental tenets of the samurai code they had internalized. The fall of Okinawa did not immediately break this psychological barrier. But it did begin the slow, painful process of erosion that would culminate in August with Emperor Hirohito's unprecedented personal intervention to order Japan's surrender. What Okinawa demonstrated beyond any possibility of denial was that courage, sacrifice, and fighting spirit, all the intangible moral qualities that Japanese military culture had elevated above material factors, could not bridge the chasm between Japan's exhausted resources and America's industrial might. The 82 days of savage combat on Okinawa had delayed the American advance by less than 3 months. The cost to Japan was the obliteration of the 32nd Army, the death of over 100,000 military personnel, the loss of tens of thousands of irreplaceable aircraft in kamikaze attacks, and the brutal demonstration that even Japan's finest defensive strategy implemented under optimal conditions could not stop the American war machine. In the weeks following June 22, as the Supreme Council continued its futile deliberations about Soviet mediation and preserving the emperor, American forces were systematically preparing for the final act. Construction battalions were turning Okinawa's captured airfields into major bases. B-29s that had flown from the Marianas could now fly from Okinawa with fighter escorts, reducing their vulnerability and increasing the intensity of the strategic bombing campaign. The naval blockade tightened further, strangling what little remained of Japan's food and fuel imports. And in the New Mexico desert, on July 16, the world's first atomic bomb was successfully tested, though this the Japanese leadership would not learn about until the weapon incinerated Hiroshima on August 6. The news reached Tokyo within hours, but the initial reports were fragmentary and confused. Military leaders struggled to understand what had happened. Both the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had their own atomic research programs and understood theoretically that such a weapon might be possible, but they had concluded it was beyond current technological capacity, certainly beyond America's ability to produce in quantity. Admiral Toyota was skeptical that Hiroshima's devastation had been caused by a single atomic bomb. If the Americans had managed to build one, he reasoned with terrible logic, they surely could not have very many. The Supreme Council convened on the morning of August 9 to discuss Hiroshima, but their meeting was interrupted by two simultaneous catastrophes. First, word arrived that the Soviet Union had declared war on Japan overnight and that Soviet forces had invaded Manchuria with overwhelming force. Second, reports came in of another city obliterated. Nagasaki had been struck by a second atomic bomb at 11:02 that morning, killing approximately 40,000 people immediately with tens of thousands more dying from radiation effects. The Soviet invasion was in some ways more psychologically devastating to the Japanese leadership than the atomic bombs. The entire strategy of seeking Soviet mediation to achieve a negotiated peace evaporated in an instant. More critically, the Soviet offensive into Manchuria demonstrated that Japan's vaunted Guandong Army, once the pride of the imperial forces and considered Japan's most elite formation, was a hollow shell incapable of mounting effective resistance against a modern mechanized force. Within days, Soviet tanks and infantry would overrun positions that Japanese propaganda had proclaimed impregnable. The illusion that Japan could mount effective resistance against invasion forces collapsed entirely. For the first time in the Supreme Council's deliberations, the three hardliners, Army Minister Anami, Army Chief Umezu, and Navy Chief Toyota, found themselves confronting a unified front from Prime Minister Suzuki, Foreign Minister Togo, and Navy Minister Yanai demanding acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration and immediate surrender. But even in the face of atomic annihilation and Soviet invasion, the hardliners could not bring themselves to accept unconditional surrender. They insisted on four conditions: Japan would disarm its own forces, Japan would conduct its own war crimes trials, there would be no occupation of Japan, and the emperor's position would be guaranteed. These terms would have effectively allowed Japan to escape accountability and preserve its militaristic government structure, terms that the Allies had already made clear were completely unacceptable. The Council deadlocked 3-3, exactly as it had deadlocked throughout July. Under normal circumstances, this stalemate would have continued indefinitely, with Japan's leadership paralyzed while American forces systematically destroyed what remained of Japanese cities and the Soviet Union carved up Japan's continental holdings. But Prime Minister Suzuki made an unprecedented decision. He requested an imperial conference in which Emperor Hirohito himself would be asked to break the deadlock by expressing his will. Just before midnight on August 9, the conference convened in the emperor's underground air raid shelter. The Big Six presented their positions, with the split clearly articulated. Baron Kichiro Hiranuma, president of the Privy Council, described Japan's inability to defend itself and the domestic problems including food shortages. For hours the debate continued in the stifling heat and poor ventilation of the bunker, with no resolution possible. Finally, around 2 in the morning on August 10, Prime Minister Suzuki addressed the emperor directly, asking him to decide between the two positions. What followed was a moment unprecedented in Japanese history. Emperor Hirohito, who had reigned but rarely ruled, who had expressed wishes but almost never given direct orders, spoke clearly and unambiguously. He had given serious thought, he said, to the situation both at home and abroad, and had concluded that continuing the war would mean the complete annihilation of the Japanese nation and the extension of human suffering worldwide. He therefore supported accepting the Potsdam Declaration with the sole condition that it not prejudice the prerogatives of the emperor as sovereign ruler. The emperor's voice broke as he spoke. Tears ran down his face. For these military leaders who had devoted their lives to service in his name, who had conceptualized their entire existence around loyalty to the throne, the sight of their living God weeping and ordering surrender was shattering. The Supreme Council, bound by their oath to obey the emperor's will, had no choice but to accept his decision. On August 10, Japan transmitted its offer to surrender via neutral Switzerland, conditioning acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration only on preservation of the emperor's position. The American response came on August 12 and contained carefully ambiguous language: the emperor's authority would be subject to the supreme commander of Allied powers. After 2 more days of agonized debate about what this meant for Hirohito's status, the emperor intervened again, declaring that peace was preferable to destruction and that Japan must accept the Allied terms. The decision was made: Japan would surrender unconditionally. But even this did not end the crisis. In the early hours of August 15, as the emperor prepared to record a radio address announcing the surrender to the Japanese people, a group of military officers led by Major Kenji Hatanaka attempted a coup. The rebels seized control of the Imperial Palace and burned Prime Minister Suzuki's residence, hoping to prevent the surrender broadcast and continue the war. The coup failed when senior officers refused to support it and the Eastern District Army declined to participate. By dawn, the conspirators had committed suicide or been arrested, but their attempt demonstrated how close Japan came to fragmenting entirely rather than accepting defeat. At noon on August 15, for the first time in history, the Japanese people heard the voice of their emperor. Speaking in the archaic court Japanese that few commoners could fully understand, Hirohito announced that Japan must endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. He never used the word surrender. He blamed the war's outcome on a new and most cruel bomb and urged his subjects to maintain their dignity in defeat. For most Japanese, listening through the static and struggling to comprehend the formal language, the message was nevertheless clear: the war was over and Japan had lost. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2 aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed for the Japanese government, and Chief of the Army General Staff Yoshijiro Yumizu signed for the military. When Yumizu was informed it would be his duty to sign the surrender document, it had required personal intervention from Emperor Hirohito to prevent him from committing suicide. As Yumizu made his signature, his aides wept openly. Standing on the deck of the Missouri, overlooking the assembled might of the Allied fleet and with American forces already beginning the occupation of Japan, the representatives of the Japanese military formally acknowledged what the fall of Okinawa had already made mathematically certain 3 months. The supreme irony was that Okinawa had accomplished exactly what Japanese planners had intended: it had terrified American military leadership about the cost of invading the home islands. General Douglas MacArthur, Admiral Chester Nimitz, and other senior commanders looked at the casualty lists from Okinawa and projected them onto the vastly larger scale of Operations Olympic and Coronet. Their estimates ranged into the hundreds of thousands of American casualties, possibly over 1 million. These projections directly influenced President Truman's decision to authorize the use of atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki rather than proceed with invasion. But for Japan, this success was meaningless. The point of inflicting terrible casualties on the Americans was supposed to force them to negotiate, to accept something less than unconditional surrender, to preserve some remnant of Japanese autonomy and honor. Instead, the casualties at Okinawa simply convinced American leadership to use weapons so terrible that they would render Japan's planned defense of the home islands irrelevant. The Americans adapted their strategy to avoid the casualties Japan wanted to inflict. They found a way to win that bypassed the final apocalyptic battle entirely. When Admiral Toyota later testified to American interrogators about the factors that led to Japan's surrender, he acknowledged what Okinawa had truly meant. The Japanese military had recognized after Okinawa that the Americans would likely not invade when they possessed atomic weapons capable of destroying cities without risking American lives. At that point, Toyota admitted, the leadership decided it was best to sue for peace. But this admission came only after the atomic bombs had fallen, after Soviet forces had invaded Manchuria, after Emperor Hirohito had broken the Supreme Council's deadlock by personally ordering surrender. The 6 weeks between Okinawa's fall and the atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, represented perhaps the most surreal period in modern military history. Japan's military and political leadership, trapped in their underground bunkers, continued to plan for Ketsugo, the final apocalyptic defense of the home islands, even as the material basis for that defense evaporated day by day. Training continued for civilian volunteers who would be armed with bamboo spears and grenades. Artillery pieces were positioned to defend beaches where American forces might land. Ammunition and fuel that no longer existed in sufficient quantities were theoretically allocated to units that could no longer move or fight effectively. The entire apparatus of the Japanese state had become a vast exercise in collective denial, a performance of resistance that everyone involved understood had become divorced from reality. The catalyst that finally shattered this paralysis came not from American invasion forces, but from the sky and from the north. At 8:15 on the morning of August 6, a single B-29 bomber named Enola Gay released an atomic bomb over Hiroshima. The weapon detonated 43 seconds later at an altitude of approximately 1,900 feet above the city center. In an instant, a fireball hotter than the surface of the sun vaporized everything within a half-mile radius. The blast wave flattened structures for miles. Thermal radiation ignited fires across the city. When the mushroom cloud finally dissipated, Hiroshima had ceased to exist as a functioning city. Approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people died immediately, with tens of thousands more dying in the following weeks from radiation exposure and injuries. Earlier, the fates of the principal figures in this tragedy reflected the profound rupture that surrender represented in Japanese political culture. Army Minister Anami committed suicide on the morning of August 15, hours before the emperor's surrender broadcast, leaving a note asking forgiveness for his failure to protect the nation. General Yumizu and Foreign Minister Togo were tried and convicted as war criminals and died in prison. Admiral Toyota became the only member of the Japanese military tried for war crimes and acquitted. Admiral Yanai remained in his position after the war. Prime Minister Suzuki resigned upon the surrender announcement. Colonel Yahara, the sole senior officer to survive the Battle of Okinawa, authored a detailed account titled The Battle for Okinawa, preserving the truth that General Ushijima had ordered him to endure the shame of survival to record. Emperor Hirohito himself avoided prosecution as a war criminal through a calculated decision by General Douglas MacArthur, who believed that a cooperating emperor would be essential for maintaining order during the occupation. MacArthur deliberately excluded evidence that might incriminate Hirohito from the Tokyo war crimes trials, and the emperor was transformed from a living god and supreme commander to a constitutional monarch and figurehead, a fate that might have seemed worse than death to many of the military leaders who had served him. The legacy of what Japanese high command said, and crucially, what they failed to say, when Okinawa fell reverberates through history in ways both obvious and subtle. Most immediately, the battle directly influenced the American decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The casualty projections for invading the home islands, extrapolated from the Okinawa experience, were so catastrophic that alternatives that might have seemed morally unthinkable became the least abhorrent choice, in the words of Secretary of War Henry Stimson. Whether this justification is morally acceptable remains among the most contentious debates of the 20th century, but the causal chain from Okinawa's casualty lists to Hiroshima's mushroom cloud is historically undeniable. More subtly, the paralysis of Japanese high command in the face of certain defeat illuminates the profound danger of political systems that cannot accommodate unwelcome truths. The Supreme Council's requirement for unanimous consent meant that acknowledging reality required every member to simultaneously overcome a lifetime of cultural conditioning, ideological commitment, and personal identity invested in service to the emperor and the concept of Japan's divine mission. This structural inability to adapt to changing circumstances transformed what might have been an orderly negotiation of surrender terms in the spring or early summer of 1945 into an apocalyptic crisis that required atomic weapons, Soviet invasion, and personal intervention by the emperor to resolve. The fall of Okinawa on June 22 exposed this dysfunction with merciless clarity. Every member of the Supreme Council understood that Japan could not win, could not negotiate advantageous terms, and could not sustain the war indefinitely. But understanding this intellectually and accepting it emotionally, accepting the need to surrender, to witness the occupation of sacred Japanese soil, to risk the emperor's abdication, to face personal responsibility for a catastrophic defeat, was a chasm that most of them could not cross without external compulsion of the most extreme kind. In this sense, the question of what Japanese high command said when Okinawa fell has a profoundly unsatisfying answer. They said very little that mattered. They continued planning for battles they knew could not be won. They pursued diplomatic initiatives they understood were futile. They debated terms of surrender they recognized the Allies would never accept. They spoke endlessly, but their words were divorced from the reality that Okinawa had laid bare, that Japan's defeat was inevitable, that further resistance was meaningless, and that every additional day of war was simply multiplying suffering without altering the final outcome. The tragedy was that the truths Okinawa revealed were evident to any objective observer long before the battle was fought. Japan's industrial base had collapsed. Its navy had been destroyed. Its army could not be supplied or reinforced. Its air force existed only as kamikaze weapons thrown into one-way missions. Its population was starving under an effective blockade. The atomic bombs and Soviet invasion simply made it impossible to continue pretending that spiritual resolve and fighting spirit could overcome material reality. When Lord Keeper Kido and Emperor Hirohito stood in that underground bunker on the morning of June 22, reading the dispatch confirming Okinawa's fall, they confronted this reality in its starkest form. 82 days of savage combat, over 100,000 Japanese military deaths, tens of thousands of aircraft sacrificed in kamikaze attacks, the destruction of the world's largest battleship, all of it had accomplished nothing but a 3-month delay and a demonstration that American forces possessed both the material capacity and the moral resolve to simply grind through any defense Japan could mount. The tragedy deepened because the lesson was ignored. 7 more weeks passed after Okinawa before surrender came, 7 weeks in which American bombers reduced Japanese cities to ash, 7 weeks in which the blockade tightened and civilians starved, 7 weeks that culminated in atomic fire over Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Soviet armies crushing Japanese forces in Manchuria. All of this suffering was for nothing. It did not change the terms of surrender, did not preserve the emperor's power, did not avoid occupation, did not spare Japan any humiliation. It simply added more names to the casualty lists and more cities to the roster of destruction. The 60+ million people who died in World War II died for many reasons: nationalist aggression, imperial expansion, racial hatred, ideological fanaticism. But a significant portion died in the war's final months for perhaps the most banal reason of all, because political systems and military bureaucracies could not acknowledge truths that undermine their ideological foundations and threaten the status of those who led them. The fall of Okinawa should have ended the war. Instead, it demonstrated how difficult it is for institutions and individuals to accept that their sacrifices have been for nothing, that their beliefs were wrong, and that continued resistance is not heroic but simply destructive. When Emperor Hirohito addressed his subjects on August 15 and told them to endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable, he was speaking a truth that applied as much to Japan's leadership as to its people. The truly unendurable thing was not defeat itself, but accepting that defeat while taking personal responsibility for the catastrophe that might have been avoided if reality had been acknowledged earlier. That acceptance came too late, at a cost measured in atomic fire and Soviet invasion and hundreds of thousands of lives that might have been spared. The words that mattered most were never spoken in the Supreme Council's deliberations. They were the words General Ushijima gave to Colonel Yahara as they prepared for death in their command cave: bear the temporary shame but endure it. But those words were about preserving the historical record, not about changing the decisions that shaped history. Japan's high command could not bear the shame of surrender when it might have prevented the atomic bombs. They could only bear it when the alternative was literal annihilation. This is the lesson that the fall of Okinawa teaches, and it is a lesson that resonates far beyond World War II. Institutions that cannot acknowledge unwelcome truths, that require unanimous consent before adapting to changed circumstances, that prioritize honor and face-saving over pragmatic responses to reality, will inevitably transform manageable crises into catastrophic collapses. The 82 days of Okinawa brought Japan nothing but suffering. The 6 weeks between Okinawa and Hiroshima brought even less. And all of it was foreseeable to anyone willing to see. On that June morning in Tokyo, as Kido watched Hirohito absorb the news of Okinawa's fall, both men understood what was coming. They understood that the war was lost, that surrender was inevitable, that continued resistance was futile. They understood, and yet the machinery of state, the culture of consensus, the weight of honor and duty, prevented that understanding from translating into action until atomic weapons and Soviet invasion made inaction impossible. That gap between understanding and action, between knowing the truth and being able to speak it, is perhaps the most human tragedy of all. And it is measured in the ashes of Hiroshima, the ruins of Nagasaki, and the hundreds of thousands who died in the summer of 1945 for a cause that was already lost on the beaches of Okinawa. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.